Hello, everyone. Welcome again to Don't Blame the CRM interview series. And as always, we focus on revenue operations. Today, I have Conor from the company called Personio with me. Welcome, Conor.
Thank you, Rico. Great to be here.
First of all, it would be nice if you could briefly introduce yourself, your background, and also the company Personio. I think HR people most likely know it, but then we also have lots of RevOps people who might not know what Personio is all about.
So I am leading the strategy and operations department with Personio for the past 2 years, and so I found my way to Personio through a number of US tech firms. So I started out my career in what was sales ops in LinkedIn in 2014 before moving into Uber, where I was leading strategy and operations for Uber in 2016, and then finally in Glassdoor most recently before moving to Personio, where I'm in my current role. Prior to that, I was working in banking and finance at the start of my career, and prior to that, I was studying engineering. Never really my strongest suit was going to be going that route. I quite enjoy problem solving and technical side, but not necessarily the hardcore coding piece, as people talk about. But ultimately within Personio, I'm leading the kind of pretty broad department, focused on building kind of the data-driven structure to help us scale, building the tech stack, leading enablement and training and sales for the sales org, and then also kind of supporting on pricing and packaging. So we're quite a broad team, lots of various skill sets within it, and then also kind of at the core of it, pretty unified through just trying to understand, okay, well, what is our core concepts here? What are we trying to achieve? And then, what's our infrastructure that we have available to us? What's our data sets available? And then how are we leveraging that to kind of maximize, our return, our efficiency. There's a lot we can do. Let's just try and figure out what are the most important things to do. So that's what I'm doing. Personio, then, for those that maybe don't know it, is probably one of our fastest growing startups in the European ecosystem, founded in Germany in 2015. So we're pretty young at this point. We've been expanding across HR and really focused on kind of working with HR professionals and companies to build a HR infrastructure that allows them to kind of scale their business, get them better access to their employees and their insights, and really at the core of it, it's about just digitizing HR as a principle for a lot of small medium businesses in Europe. And I think that's the unique pieces. We're solely focused on small medium businesses because we just see that this is a huge area of opportunity for them and also a lot of challenge. So it's a pretty good fit. So we've scaled quite a lot. When I joined 2 years ago, we were about 400 people. I think today we're around 1,600 people. So it's been quite a ride from that side, but it's been pretty special. And I think just ultimately at the core of it, while I was kind of the first strategy and ops person to come over and RevOps person involved, kind of data and infrastructure was always there as like a leading kind of baseline for how they made any decisions in terms of it, but I think now it's like once you hit that tipping point, it's really the important part to help you really scale and mature and be efficient.
So 1,600 people today. How big is the operations or RevOps team?
So my org is 32 people this year. Split across kind of the kind of 5 core functions. So, really focused on kind of the data side and kind of the core RevOps, we've got around 7 people. And then there are we're still a little distributed, just in the nature of kind of how we operate. So we do kind of work very, very closely with, our kind of CX and our finance partners as well. But broadly speaking, we're a pretty lean and efficient team, I would say.
Yeah. And in the previous episodes, we've been discussing RevOps individuals and what type of background they have. Like when you're building that team, like what type of skill sets do you need for RevOps? Because there's, of course, processes, there's data, there's technologies, you mentioned pricing. So what type of skill sets and backgrounds do you feel are really good for RevOps roles?
I know for me, the one thing I always seek, and I think what makes anyone successful, and I don't think it's pretty much exclusive to RevOps. I actually feel like it's just an inherent trait that will make anyone successful. It's like just innate curiosity. And it's a curiosity combined with an intellect, and that's a pretty special, potent combination, because it helps you always want to see what's really happening. I'm curious, and within that, then that kind of builds a drive. Sorry, that you don't stop till you find it, and it's that piece. And then if you have that with the right intellect and the right skill sets in terms of just like kind of technical skills, then you can kind of get unleashed on certain problems, and you're just going to keep seeking and really focusing on trying to get to the root of it. One thing I always say with the team is that our job isn't to find the answer necessarily. It's really to think about what's the next best question to ask, because it's very rare you look at something and you find the answer straight away. Sometimes you might, but it tends to be, hey, we're seeing this weakness here, this gap here. Why? You look at it, okay, well, what's the next question you're going to ask? And you're almost kind of going through that kind of process. And so it's about that kind of methodology in terms of just kind of seeking and moving with it. So for me, it's hard to interview for. It's challenging to find, but I think it's like that combination of just innate curiosity and then intellect that comes with it. And then, you discover that through like their kind of their career, their history, meeting with them, asking them questions, giving them hypothetical situations and seeing kind of how their mind works. And, ultimately that to me is like probably the most important piece I look for. I probably even have a bias towards it, but I think it's a healthy bias to have for this industry.
Yeah. And then some ops teams, they have one person doing sales ops for new business, somebody doing ops for CS, then marketing ops, maybe somebody who focuses on finance. Some other teams might do all those things at the same time, but they have one team focusing on data, another one focusing on maybe technology, a third one processing and playbooks, one team focusing on KPIs. Like, how do you organize the team? Like, do you have like separate sales ops and then somebody doing CS ops, or how have you organized the team?
No, so for me, on that one, it kind of actually goes back to, I remember in LinkedIn in 2014, I was responsible for, when I joined new business, sales ops. And it kind of struck me about 2 years later when I was at Uber, where I was building everything from scratch, how I never spent really any time in LinkedIn worrying about marketing and marketing pipeline and marketing source pipeline and metrics like that. And you might find that very strange to think you're running new business sales ops. How is that not a critical part of it? Because it was so incredibly siloed. It was like, oh, you've got a marketing ops team. They worry about that. You have an SD ops team and they're going to worry about, pipeline need. You just worry about AEs and say quota, coverage, books of business, and territory alignment, and then go. And it was just fascinating then to think, even just 2 years later, as I was building it myself, just questioning quite quickly, why was it so siloed? Why was that not a unified function? Because pretty much interdependent on each other. There's probably huge opportunities for efficiency by getting that right. And I've no idea how it's set up today, but I assume they probably made some tweaks with that as it matured. But for me, then it was like kind of moving that forward. So when it comes to Personio and how we get structured, we don't have that split out. We do have some specialists specifically within marketing operations, because obviously with like optimization and campaign spend and stuff like that, it is a pretty unique and learned skill set, and so we have that. But overall, when it comes to, let's say, new business, we don't have a new business focus in terms of an individual, but like our team is saying, right, we get focused on new business and growth, which is the biggest lever for us as a company. How do we then combine all the relevant functions across marketing, sales development, partnerships, and then the AEs themselves, and kind of combine that into more of a unified view, and then building our structure around that. And so that's kind of how it is. So we try and not keep it within it. We do have some with our growth business and our CX team, a slightly different approach and philosophy with that, but that's just a unique nuance to Personio as a company and how we operate in the space and the type of product we offer. We're not a per seat basis necessarily. We're more based on the company size, and so there's a little bit less optimization on the growth side required. So there's more of a heavier weighting on the acquisition side of the business.
Yeah, and I know that you're using Salesforce, so I would imagine that that's sort of one important technology that you use. How much time do you spend on these tools and technologies, thinking of implementation, choosing new technologies, integrations, versus some other things such as focusing maybe on processes? You mentioned price. Like, how do you split your time, and how does the team split?
We try and think about everything together at once, and I don't want to have that as like some kind of like waffly answer around it, but it's actually like an observation I've shared it with our team recently, where we're a function that's specific domains within the function and areas of expertise, like your Salesforce administrators and specialists in systems and tooling aren't necessarily the same types of people that are like your strategy consultants and folks like that. But what I've been educating on and really pushing and leading about is it's how that all kind of comes together as a single unit that really matters. And so, if we think about, your tech stack and your systems, it really is just like a kind of a vessel to achieve, your goal, which is like, hey, we want to capture this data. We need to understand what's happening with our business. It's about, creating an audit platform and a trail that we can manage and report and build it. It's serving a broader purpose than just being, let's say, an IT role. And it's actually more of a strategic role that's sitting at the table, because then it's like, how are you feeding back in? What do you think we could be optimizing within it? Learning more about what the process is or how the team are operating. So trying to raise that role into more of a commercial role, which is why I see it sitting within the RevOps function and part of our team, because it's making sure it's sitting at that table with a commercial hat on and not necessarily an IT hat on. But then actually that's just one example of how that then partners. And if you think about, enablement, which is also within our organization, it's not just enablement with the sales team on their technical selling and skills. It's also thinking about how do you enable across, you're building incredible KPI dashboards and reporting and insights, or you're building new process. How is that integrating with your tech stack and your team to optimize for it? And then how are you enabling on it? What's the point in building stuff if you're not teaching people how to use it and maximize value from it, and then bringing that to the heart of it all? So for me, within the team and how we then operate, it's kind of thinking about the unification of all of them, as opposed to the kind of separate components as individual kind of work streams. And so my hardest job and kind of the biggest challenge I have is to not fall into the trap myself of focusing on a specific work stream, but actually making sure that I'm more thinking about how are these work streams working together. So I'm not thinking about where do I spend my time. It's more, are they communicating? Are they working together? Do they have a common goal and an outcome? And what's the purpose? And then are they building behind that objective to be as efficient as possible to achieve it, or just collaborating more on it? And so it's imperfect, and you do tend to, like at times like this, just get down the rabbit hole on planning and stuff like that, which is a little bit more unique. But I think that's my aspiration. Do I achieve it all the time? No, but I think it's a critical part of it. And I feel that's the key goal for me with everything that we're doing right now, is just to make sure that we're unifying the functions together and then acting as a collective, because we can get a far bigger impact on that.
Yeah. And then I'm thinking about, where does RevOps fit in the organization? Are you reporting to CEO or Chief Revenue Officer or CRO? Is RevOps team, or you as a leader, are you having your own KPIs, maybe even like performance-based components on the salary, or are you basically just using the company objectives and key results and metrics, exactly, and those are also the metrics for you?
Yeah, so we're OKR based in terms of how we get operated. My salary is my salary. There's no a component linked to pure metrics in terms of like an OTI based component, but no, it's predominantly based around shaping, what are the key objectives, key results for us as a company, what are our principles, building, defining it, and then kind of executing and then aligning behind that.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, those OKRs, key results, objectives, are they on a quarterly basis, monthly basis, annual basis? Like, what's the frequency of OKR?
We do a half yearly piece. Majority will be annual. There's some kind of key principled ones specifically within go-to-market and sales that are going to be related to achieving your business goals in terms of commercial goals. So they'll be annual, but predominantly we kind of structure it into half yearly focus areas with then some commonality across them.
Yeah. When we're recording this, we're having Slush event, and we hosted a side event yesterday. We had quite a few RevOps people there. When I was asking about the biggest challenge for them, some individuals said that they sort of know what they want to do and they're doing it, but it's sometimes difficult to make sure that they can actually make an impact, because they're working with sales, they're working with CS, with marketing and finance. Yeah. These individuals are not reporting to RevOps. RevOps is working with them and helping them to be more successful. Do you have any tips or pieces of advice? Like, how do you make sure that you can actually have an impact and you can actually impact the figures, even though you're doing ops for sales and CS, but then you have, of course, sales department and CS department and marketing department.
Yeah. I think it's about establishing credibility. It's a question I ask in lots of interviews because, you know, sometimes if you can't establish credibility, you will probably struggle to make that impact. And you establish credibility. It's, you know, consistency over time. You know, it's like, you know, saying you'll do something and doing it and executing. It's about, you know, showing that kind of intellect and skill set that kind of proves that, you know, you can be, you know, trusted or not even just invested in, and say, right, this person, just leave it to them. They know what they're doing. And so for me, it's really kind of focusing on, okay, how do I establish my credibility and my nous? So that's going to be kind of focused around, okay, what's my outputs? What's the areas? Do I understand the business in its totality? Can I have a fluent conversation with somebody in finance and understanding what really matters to that person in finance? They're not just seeing your picture, they're seeing the broader picture across the company. So how are you inputting into that? And are you able to add, you know, kind of value to that conversation? And so that could be, depending on who you're speaking to within that, you know, do you understand about IFRS and classifications like this? You don't need to be an expert in it, but can you build a baseline knowledge of what they're doing? Similar then within CS, you know, the very different kind of structure and how they're going to operate, and like, what are they motivated around? You know, do you understand how they get measured? Are you thinking about NPS? Are you just thinking about churn? Are you thinking about NPS and these other scores that matter? How does that fit? How are they communicating with product and understanding it? How are you aligning with them to think about product feedback, etc., like this, and creating these more common areas that you can kind of collaborate and work upon? And then it's ultimately by doing that, one, you're going to be better with your work because you're going to be thinking about their business units more proactively. And then you can just bring that to the table a little bit more. So that's really about where you establish that credibility through topics like that. And, you know, it isn't easy. That takes experience. It takes time. But I think, you know, it can be done at any level where you just think about, well, do I think about their business at all? Do I know how their business is run? And I think that's the first and most important step to be doing.
Yeah. Let's talk about data a little bit. I mean, you've been growing super fast. You mentioned founded in 2015, now already 1,600 employees, meaning that you have lots of customers. Vaino is one of your customers as well.
Thank you.
And Vaino as a company, we provide company data for RevOps teams. So what are the sort of the data properties, data fields, data categories that you're thinking right now in these days? Because obviously there's so many different data points you can
everything.
Industry data, company size, momentum, intent data, technographics. Like, what are the things that you're working with and sort of hot topics for Personio, for example, at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting actually. Within Personio, we're currently recruiting for a VP of data as a very specific standalone function. So anyone listening, if they want to reach out to me and share any names, or if they're interested, I would love to speak with them. That role will report to our COO, but I'm sure Jonas would be happy for me to push a little bit on that one. But I think for us, it's about one, we really want to focus more about kind of the collaborative function around our data sets and moving towards being a truly data-led company. And I say this, sorry, with the greatest respect when it comes to things, but I hear people speak about data, and in a strange way, it's almost like someone talks about words. Kind of just sounds a bit like abstract. You're like, what's it mean? It's like, well, you know, words is just a word. A data is just a data point. It's what you do with it. How do you join it together? How do you tell a story? And, you know, combine it into something. And so for me, you know, just saying, hey, we're data focused kind of is, you know, excuse some bad language, is kind of just bullshit. It's like saying, well, what are you doing with it? What's that really mean? And how are you kind of leaning into that and getting behind it? You know, so how are you thinking about building your data infrastructure and your tech stack? You know, what is your baseline warehousing philosophy? How are you considering data lineage and your architecture around that? How's that then flowing across all your departments? So from your product team, how's that flowing in? From your finance team, from your sales team, from your CX marketing teams, etc. How are then you staffing behind it to make sure that you have the right infrastructure with data engineering and folks like this? So it's not just saying we want to focus on data. It's also thinking about, well, what are you doing to enable you to do that? And then once you get that component right, and I think we're still on a journey to do that, but we recognize it's the most important aspect for us now as we're scaling to get right. It's then to start thinking about, okay, well, what do we need? And what are the critical data points that will help us, understand, our next steps? So, in a marketing space, it's going to be around, for me, attribution and getting way smarter with how we're spending and where we're targeting, how we're using it. I think over the next year or 2 years, there's going to be a whole lot more focus from investors and from the outside market on, not just your growth rate, but also on your kind of profit margin, and your burn rates, etc., like that. So, for us, it's about making sure we have real clarity in that. So focusing a lot of our data efforts into how are we optimizing and building proper attribution, thinking then about the whole customer life cycle from end to end. How are we thinking about optimizing that along the way? I always talk about, it's just a series of binary questions that occur from, will I interact with this banner ad, or will I interact with this piece of content I see, or will I answer this outreach from an SDR? It's a series of these yes or no decisions that get made subconsciously or consciously, and it's about how do we optimize for each of them. So for me, it's thinking about that layer and then moving down to, okay, well, what's the data set required? What are the data points that we need? And so, in Vinu's case, it could be, what can you help us with in terms of the data sets that you can provide around companies, their product suites, what they have available, what industries they're operating in, and how do I then fold that in to maybe optimize our books of business or maybe our marketing outreach cadences, et cetera, like this. And so understanding what you want to solve for, and then what's the data required to do it. And if you have it, great. If you don't have it, do you buy it or can you manufacture it? And kind of taking that approach and philosophy.
You mentioned data infra and also data warehousing. I feel that companies that are using Salesforce, some of them, they sort of see Salesforce being the place of master data, and then all these data vendors and other tools needed to be integrated with Salesforce, while some others, they're setting up their own cloud data lakes and data warehouses. Maybe they use Snowflake or BigQuery and whatnot. Like, what's your approach? Or like, is it something that it's always evolving? Like, do you see that CRM in this case, or the Salesforce being the master place of master data, and then you integrate everything with Salesforce, or are you building a cloud database?
Yeah, like for me, I think Salesforce it's just its limitations. Yeah. And so ultimately it's a wonderful CRM. It has its flaws, but I think it's so successful because it's so good at what it does. And it's more, I would think, about customer facing, with the end customer being the sales and the leadership team. For us, we're really focusing on building the data lake and data warehousing infrastructure. We're currently using Athena, and that structure, we're really now focusing on what's required for us longer term to really start to scale that out. And then how do we start bringing that to the table a lot more? And so, that's why I speak about we're recruiting for these roles, because it's a critical part for us to get right, just because there's so much opportunity for us if we do that effectively and correctly to be more efficient. So that's kind of our consideration on it. I'm not the crazy technical specialist on them topics. We've some wonderful people in the company that kind of specialize and focus on that. But for me, I know enough about it to know that that's the area we need to be investing heavily in.
Yeah, sounds good. We have lots of people also in the audience who might have right now their first RevOps role. And of course, in a smaller company, like if you're a startup or you're hitting 50 employees, 100 employees, you don't have a team of 30, right? So you might be the first RevOps person. What would be your piece of advice? You have been in ops and strategy.
I've been there.
Yeah. So like, how do you get started? Because obviously you want to be successful. And let's say that you're in B2B SaaS. But it might be difficult to know how to get started and what to do first. So what's your piece of advice for all the new RevOps people?
There's 1,000 answers, and I don't think any of them are fundamentally better than the other, or any are wrong. But I think it's dependent on what you're doing in the company you're in, and how things are. But I think, broadly speaking, you have, I would say to anyone, you've probably the most interesting role in that company. And no disrespect to founders or product managers like yourself, but I feel you're right at the intersection of everything. It's where your product gets monetized, via whatever channel, via kind of a online digital model, via a B2B SaaS sales organization. It's about where your kind of customer and managing the customer lifecycle becomes an important part of it, and you're kind of right at the point where everything is flowing through it. And so it's going to be overwhelming. There's going to be moments where you're just going to be like, this is crazy. I'm going to struggle here. There's too much on. We don't have enough resources. And I think that's the case. You never will. We are an expense. We are a function that has a cost associated. There's a value, but we're always going to be a little bit understaffed. And so it's like about really just focusing on, what really matters. So if you're in a small startup, you're probably thinking it's about the next 10 customers we get. It's the next customer and the customer after that. So if you're optimizing your work to say, well, how am I supporting and achieving that goal? Am I building, the right data sets that are required for that? Am I, optimizing some of our marketing work that needs to be done to at least help where I can, even if it's outside of it? But if you just go back to the kind of core, what's the single most important thing for us right now? And I suspect in a smaller company, it's acquiring the next customer or whatever. And then as you scale, it's about ensuring then that you actually have the ability to scale efficiently, and you're putting the infrastructure in place to allow that. Because, there will come a point where you will scale without any RevOps or any support. And then there'll come a point where without that, you're going to start to really slow down if you don't get it right. So I think it's about just making sure that you're really focused on what matters most right now. And then the secondary component of it is just trying to understand what's best in class look like, meeting people, understanding it, and then thinking and always planning for the future, and building for that structure around it. So that would be my advice, and how I've approached it in the past.
Yeah, really, really good advice.
Yeah.
Last question. One of the reasons why we decided to do this podcast is to share knowledge, share best practices. And I feel that if you think of product management or marketing or sales, there's so many places you can go and educate yourself.
Yeah.
How about you? What are the sources, communities, places where you go? How do you keep up? How do you learn new things? How do you make sure that you know what's happening? What are the best practices in RevOps?
Meeting people like you is always a good start. But I think it's twofold. So one, I always feel, leading an enablement team, I always speak about self-enablement is the most important part of it. And so, I love that question because, no one's ever going to teach you or tell you what to do. And maybe if they do, you shouldn't listen to them, or sometimes you should. It just depends. But broadly speaking, it's about how you seek that information. And so, the first place is, and I remember this from, when I joined Uber, I was the first hire for Uber for Business in Europe. And I didn't know what to do a lot of the time for a lot of the stuff. You will figure it out. Mm. And so the best you will ever get, and the best learning and experience you will ever get, is what you're able to solve for yourself. And, you will get really good at problem solving, because anyone that ends up in this world is curious and cares about problem solving. And so you will figure it out. And so sometimes just figuring it out on your own is far more valuable than trying to see how do others do it, because you'll probably find the right way of doing it for you or for the team or for what's needed. However, I will caveat that and say, make sure that you are seeking that knowledge and kind of networking. And so, for me, I'm very fortunate to have a wonderful network of peers and professionals that across the industry that I can just shoot questions to and ask them for advice on. And then in terms of kind of checking in and reading and looking into it, staying very connected in a number of groups. There's some, great groups on LinkedIn that I'm a member of that, kind of help with kind of best practice sharing and industry standard pieces, and just even kind of migrating from sales ops to RevOps. I was learning about it through these before it was happening in our lives. So I do feel it's about kind of finding that balance between what are you just going to learn yourself and figure it out, because that's who you are. You wouldn't be doing that job if you weren't good at doing that stuff. But then how are you then also kind of, complementing that with the more kind of structured, strategic and kind of theoretical stuff that's happening out there in the market. And so it's listening to podcasts like this, it's reading books that are interest, just being in the space, and, kind of thinking about being that person who's just kind of innately curious to get better at what they're doing. And so that would be my advice on it.
Yeah, it almost feels like we're closing the circle, because we started with skill sets. You mentioned curiosity, and it's also I guess, what's needed if
Yeah.
you want to keep educating yourself. That curiosity is the key, and you also need to just go out there and then be active, and obviously over time build network.
That's it. It's like you can't read about it all the time. You sometimes just have to do it, and you're going to mess it up. You're going to get it wrong. I can tell you about all the failures I've had and like big F-ups I've made in planning or stuff like that. But you know, at the core of it, like it was a culmination tended to be always going in the right trajectory and in the right area. And so, you know, that was, you know, what are you getting from that and learning from it? I think that was very worthwhile.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the interview, Conor. And I hope you'll have a great day.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Great to speak to you.